What do you do when the two people closest to you betray you in the worst way possible? David never thought he'd question his friendship with Jake or his marriage to Emily. For years, his life had felt stable, even predictable. Jake had been his best friend since high school, more like a brother than a friend. They'd gone through every life milestone together, and David had trusted him with everything, including his family. Emily, his wife of 10 years, was the woman he'd always dreamed of. She was warm, smart, and supportive, and their lives together had been everything he'd hoped for. But lately things felt different. It started with small things that David had brushed off at first. Emily seemed distant, avoiding eye contact, and making excuses to be out of the house more often. Jake, usually open and talkative, was suddenly hard to reach. David's gut hinted that something was wrong, but he dismissed it, telling himself he was overthinking things. But the nagging feeling persisted, quietly gnawing at him. One evening, he came home earlier than usual. As he walked up to the front door, he noticed Emily standing by the window, texting with an odd, secretive smile on her face. When she saw him, she quickly tucked her phone away, giving him a hurried, distracted greeting. David felt a pang of doubt, but forced a smile, convincing himself that it was probably nothing. However, the strange behavior didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, Emily's excuses to stay out late became more frequent, and Jake seemed to avoid him altogether. David tried to shrug it off, but with every missed call and half-hearted excuse, his suspicions grew. Then came the night that changed everything. David was working late, and stopped by a coffee shop near Jake's office. As he walked in, he noticed a familiar figure sitting at a corner table. Jake, with his arm casually draped around Emily's shoulders. They didn't see him, engrossed in conversation and laughing together as if they were alone in the world. David's heart sank, and he felt his world shatter in an instant. He quietly left the shop, his mind racing, refusing to believe what he'd just witnessed. But the image of his best friend and his wife, together in that way, was burned into his memory. That night, David lay awake, his mind replaying every recent interaction, piecing together moments he'd once dismissed. The realization was agonizing. He knew then that he couldn't let this betrayal go. They'd destroyed his trust, torn apart everything he thought was real, and as the hours passed, his sadness and confusion turned into something else, a cold, calculated anger. David was done being the victim. If they thought he'd sit by and accept their betrayal, they had no idea what he was capable of. That night, after seeing them together, David couldn't shake the betrayal. He sat alone, trying to understand how the two people he trusted most could deceive him in this way. Every moment he'd spent with Emily and Jake flashed through his mind, and he wondered how long they'd been hiding this. The anger and heartbreak twisted inside him, each emotion feeding off the other. But David knew he couldn't act on impulse. He had to know the truth, every detail of their betrayal. If they were going to ruin his life, he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of catching him off guard. No, he'd play his cards close to his chest, just like they had done. The next morning, David pretended everything was fine, smiling and going through his usual routine with Emily. She acted as if nothing had happened, giving him a casual kiss on the cheek, and talking about her plans for the day. It was almost laughable. He listened, nodding, but his mind was already elsewhere, formulating a plan. He would find out exactly how deep their betrayal went. In the days that followed, David paid close attention to every detail, noticing things he'd ignored before. Emily would disappear at odd hours with vague excuses, her phone always out of reach whenever he was nearby. Jake, too, seemed oddly busy, avoiding their regular meetups. The more David watched, the clearer it became. They had been playing him for a fool, and they didn't even seem worried about getting caught. One night, while Emily was in the shower, David picked up her phone, his heart pounding as he unlocked it. There, in plain sight, was a message from Jake: "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Let's make sure we're careful he doesn't suspect a thing." David felt his chest tighten as he read the words, confirming his worst fears. But instead of confronting her, he put the phone back, careful to leave no trace that he'd seen the message. Let them think he was clueless. It would make what he planned to do next even sweeter. Over the following weeks, David documented everything. He took screenshots of messages, recorded call logs, and saved photos that proved their affair. He knew that when the time was right, he'd reveal it all in a way that would leave them with no escape. The more he gathered, the angrier he became. But with that anger came a cold, calm focus. He decided that he wouldn't just expose them, he'd make sure they felt the same humiliation and betrayal they'd inflicted on him. They thought they could hide their lies behind smiles and fake excuses, but David was always one step ahead now, watching, waiting, and calculating. One evening, he heard Emily talking on the phone in a low voice, her tone soft and affectionate. David's jaw clenched as he listened, pretending to be absorbed in a book. When she ended the call and tried to act normal, he looked at her with a smile, hiding the storm brewing inside him. "You have no idea what's coming," he thought, keeping his expression calm. In his mind, David began rehearsing how he'd confront them. He wanted every word to cut deep, each sentence carefully chosen to mirror the pain they'd put him through. But he'd keep it all hidden until the perfect moment. Timing was everything. The next morning he sent Jake a casual message, suggesting they meet up the following week for drinks, as they used to. Jake agreed, completely oblivious to David's knowledge. And then, to complete the charade, David kissed Emily on his way out the door, letting her think she'd fooled him once again. But David knew he was the one in control now. He felt a strange sense of calm, knowing he held the evidence, the power to turn their lives upside down. They thought they were safe, but he'd make sure their betrayal didn't just end his trust, it would end their reputations, their happiness, and any future they'd planned together. For the first time since discovering the affair, David felt a sense of relief. He was no longer the betrayed husband, the friend left in the dark. Now, he was the one pulling the strings, and soon, Emily and Jake would know exactly what that felt like. David's anger had turned to ice-cold determination. After catching Emily and Jake in their affair, he knew he couldn't just confront them and let them walk away unscathed. No, this betrayal ran too deep, and they would feel the full weight of what they had done. For days David kept up the facade of the clueless husband and loyal friend. He smiled, he nodded, and he acted like nothing was wrong, all the while carefully planning his revenge. Every small clue, every piece of evidence he gathered made his anger sharper and his plan clearer. If they thought they could betray him without consequences, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. One evening, David discovered their next plan. Emily mentioned she'd be away for the weekend, claiming it was a work trip, while Jake casually brought up a family gathering out of town. They didn't realize David knew the truth, that they'd be spending that weekend together in a secluded cabin a few hours away. David felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his voice calm. He even encouraged Emily to go, knowing that this was his chance to execute his plan. "You deserve a break," he said softly, smiling as she kissed him goodbye, blissfully unaware of what he had in store for her and Jake. The weekend finally arrived, and David drove up to the cabin ahead of time, setting up hidden cameras and recording devices around the property. He made sure he had everything positioned to capture their every move, from the moment they entered to the moment he'd confront them. He was thorough, knowing that this evidence would be critical for what he planned to do next. As he sat in his car, parked a safe distance from the cabin, David watched them arrive. Jake's car pulled up, and the two of them got out, laughing and talking as if they had no care in the world. The sight of them together, so casual and happy, sent a wave of anger through him, but he stayed focused. Soon they would be caught in their own lies, and there would be no way out. From his hidden vantage point, David watched as they settled into the cabin, oblivious to the fact that every word, every touch was being recorded. They had no idea that their betrayal was being documented, piece by piece, and that David was capturing it all. As the hours passed, David's anger began to turn to a strange sense of satisfaction. They thought they were getting away with it, that they had outsmarted him, but he was the one holding all the cards now. He watched as they relaxed, laughed, and embraced, each moment fueling his resolve. They would soon realize the extent of their mistake. But David's plan wasn't just to capture their affair, he wanted them to feel the humiliation and betrayal he'd experienced. He wanted them to know that he was done being the victim, that he was in control now. As David continued watching from his hidden vantage point, his thoughts raced. He recalled every moment he had shared with both Emily and Jake, the countless memories, the trust he had invested in them, and the silent loyalty he had once believed was mutual. But now, as he watched their actions unfold on the live feed from the cabin, that trust felt like a joke they had played on him. They were completely oblivious to the fact that they were being recorded. David had set up the hidden cameras so meticulously that no one would suspect a thing. The first camera, hidden in the corner of the main room, captured every detail of their interactions, while another in the bedroom recorded the sounds of their conversations and every whispered word. The evidence was piling up, and David felt a grim satisfaction as he watched their betrayal play out in real time. Later that evening, as he reviewed the footage he'd already recorded, David knew he had all he needed to confront them and ruin whatever fantasies they had been living. But he wanted his confrontation to be more than just a showdown. It had to be something they would remember forever, a moment that would haunt them, just as their betrayal had haunted him. The next morning, David decided it was time to confront them. But he wasn't just going to walk in and demand an explanation. No, he wanted his entry to be as shocking as possible, leaving them with no escape. So he planned his approach carefully, making sure he had all the recorded evidence ready to play at the perfect moment. He would expose their betrayal, every single detail, right in front of them. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, David walked up to the cabin door and knocked. There was a pause, then hurried footsteps from inside as someone approached. Jake opened the door, his expression shifting from casual to horrified the moment he recognized who was standing there. Behind him, Emily appeared, her face instantly paling as she took in the sight of David standing in the doorway. "David," Emily stammered, her voice shaking. "What are you doing here?" "Good question," David replied, a calm smile on his face. "Mind if I come in?" Before either of them could respond, he stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind him. The atmosphere in the room was tense, and David relished the fear and confusion in their expressions. They were scrambling for excuses, desperately trying to come up with something that could explain away what he already knew. David took a seat in the armchair across from them, looking both of them over with a steely gaze. They remained standing, exchanging nervous glances as they waited for him to speak. "You know," David began, his voice cold and controlled, "I thought you two were my closest friends. My wife and my best friend, the people I trusted most in this world. And yet, here we are." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Jake shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet David's gaze. Emily's hands were shaking, and her eyes darted between David and the floor, clearly struggling to come up with a response. "David, I can explain," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, I'm sure you can," he interrupted sharply. "But I don't want to hear any lies. I know exactly what's been going on between you two." He reached into his bag, pulling out his laptop and opening it. "In fact, I have something you should see." With that, David played the video he'd recorded the previous day, the footage of them together, laughing, talking and embracing, all captured in crystal clear detail. Emily gasped, covering her mouth with her hand, as the reality of the situation sank in. Jake looked like he'd been struck, his face draining of color as he stared at the screen, realizing the extent of David's evidence. David watched them both, his face expressionless as they processed what they were seeing. For months they had lived a lie, and now, every hidden moment was laid bare before them. "You two thought you could betray me, hide your little affair from me," David continued, his voice cold with controlled rage. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That I'd be too blind to notice?" Emily's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, her voice trembling as she tried to respond. "David, please. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Wasn't supposed to be like this," David repeated, his tone mocking. "What exactly was it supposed to be, Emily? A harmless fling? A little secret between you two?" He shook his head, disgusted. "You both disgust me." He turned his gaze to Jake, who was still staring at the floor, too ashamed to look him in the eye. "And you," David said, his voice sharp with contempt. "I trusted you. I thought you were my friend, my brother. But clearly I was wrong." Jake finally looked up, his eyes filled with guilt. "David, I don't know what to say." David gave a bitter laugh. "Of course you don't. Because there's nothing you can say to justify this. Nothing." There was a heavy silence, as his words hung in the air, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on them like a crushing force. David took a deep breath, feeling the anger and pain churning inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't finished yet. "You both ruined what we had, destroyed the trust I thought we shared," he continued, his voice hard. "And now, you're going to live with the consequences." David took out a flash drive from his bag, tossing it onto the coffee table in front of them. "This has everything, every message, every call log. Every piece of evidence I've gathered, it's all here. And I've already sent copies to everyone we know. Family, friends, colleagues, they all know exactly what you've done. Emily's face went pale as she looked at the flash drive, horror dawning on her as she realized the full extent of David's plan. Jake's mouth fell open, his expression one of shock and disbelief. You can't be serious," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, I'm dead serious," David replied, his tone ice cold. "I wanted everyone to know the truth. I wanted them to see you both for who you really are." They stared at him, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and shame, but David felt nothing for them. Their regret meant nothing now. It was far too late for apologies or second chances. They had made their choices, and now, they would pay the price. David stood up, casting one last look at the two of them. "I'm done here," he said quietly. "You've both lost me, and everything we had together. Enjoy what's left of your lives. I hope it was worth it." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving them behind to face the ruins of their betrayal. As David walked away from the cabin, a weight began to lift off his shoulders. He'd finally confronted them, watched them crumble, and left them with no way to escape their shame. They were now forced to face the truth, just as he had been forced to endure their lies. But David's plan wasn't entirely complete. He wanted to ensure that the consequences of their actions reached beyond that cabin. In his mind he could see the life he'd once shared with Emily, the loyalty he'd thought was unbreakable between him and Jake. Now, all of that had been exposed for the betrayal it was, and he wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. Over the next few days, David watched as the fallout began to take effect. The flash drive he had left them with contained everything save texts, call logs, even the video footage he'd recorded. He had also made sure that key people in their lives, their closest friends, their families, and their colleagues received the same evidence, the story laid bare for everyone to see. David wanted them to understand the gravity of their choices and to know that they'd lost everything. It didn't take long for the reactions to start pouring in. Friends who had once admired Emily and Jake began to turn away, appalled by what they'd done. David's phone lit up with messages from mutual friends, each one expressing disbelief, support, or sheer anger at the betrayal. He felt no need to explain himself, only a grim satisfaction as the truth did its work. Emily tried calling him again, leaving long, tearful messages begging him to talk to her. Her words blurred into apologies and desperate explanations, but David couldn't bring himself to listen. He deleted every voicemail, every text, refusing to give her a second chance to manipulate him. She'd made her choice, and he was done allowing her into his life. Jake's response was more silent, but David heard through their mutual friends that Jake had tried to repair his reputation. He'd attempted to convince people that it had all been a misunderstanding, that things had gotten out of hand. But no one believed him. The evidence was too clear, too damning. Jake was left with nothing but regret, and as more people turned their backs on him, his isolation grew. In time, Emily began to experience the professional consequences of her actions. Rumors spread at her workplace, whispers that couldn't be silenced. Her once solid career now carried the stain of her affair, making it difficult for her to focus. She tried to brush it off, but the shame weighed heavily on her. Eventually her performance at work began to suffer, and she found herself under scrutiny from her boss, who was less than sympathetic. Jake, too, faced similar challenges. His position in the company that he'd once held proudly was no longer secure. The affair had tainted his professional image, and his colleagues became wary of associating with him. Doors that had once been open now closed, and he struggled to keep up appearances, realizing that his actions had left a permanent mark on his life. While Emily and Jake faced the consequences of their choices, David began his own journey of healing. The confrontation had given him a sense of closure, but the pain of betrayal still lingered. He couldn't erase the memories or the trust he'd once placed in them, but he knew he had to rebuild his life this time on his own terms. David decided to sell the house he had shared with Emily. Every room held a memory, each one tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. Moving out felt like a necessary step toward freeing himself from the shadows of his past. He found a new place in a quiet neighborhood, somewhere he could start fresh, without the constant reminders of his previous life. As he settled into his new home, David found comfort in creating a space that was entirely his own. He began new routines, small habits that helped him rediscover a sense of peace. Mornings spent reading on the porch, afternoons exploring new hobbies. These moments became his sanctuary, a reminder that life could still be fulfilling even after the pain. In time he opened up to his close friends and family about his experience, sharing the details of what had happened. Their support became a lifeline, reminding him that he wasn't alone in his journey. Slowly, he felt the wounds begin to heal, the anger and resentment replaced by a quiet resilience. Months passed, and David's life started to take on a new rhythm. He still had moments of anger, flashes of memory that reminded him of everything he had lost, but he was healing, building a future that no longer included Emily or Jake. One evening, as he was unwinding after a long day, David received an unexpected message from Emily. She had written him a long email, her words filled with apologies, regrets, and pleas for forgiveness. She claimed to have changed, to have realized the depth of her mistakes, and begged him to give her one last chance to explain herself. David sat back, reading her words, feeling a mixture of emotions. Part of him wanted to hear her out, to finally get the answers he'd once craved. But another part of him knew that listening to her would only reopen old wounds. He didn't need her explanations, he'd already made peace with the truth. In the end, David chose not to respond. He closed the email and blocked her address, knowing that there was nothing she could say that would undo the damage she had caused. Her attempts at reconciliation were empty words to him now, remnants of a past he had already moved beyond. As for Jake, David heard through mutual friends that he had withdrawn from everyone. The scandal had left him with few allies, and the shame of what he'd done weighed heavily on him. Jake's life had become a lonely existence, his friendships shattered, his career in ruins, and his reputation destroyed. David felt no sympathy for him. Jake had chosen his path, and now he was living with the consequences. David refused to let himself be dragged back into the drama. He'd spent enough time and energy on them, now it was time to focus on his own happiness. With both Emily and Jake out of his life, David began to explore new interests. He started volunteering at a local shelter, finding solace in helping others who were going through their own struggles. The act of giving back brought him a sense of fulfillment, reminding him that there was still goodness in the world, even after the betrayal he had endured. He also made new friends, people who knew nothing of his past, and found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. These new connections became a source of strength, helping him to rebuild his trust in others. As he looked back on everything he had been through, David realized that the experience had changed him. He was no longer the person he had been before the betrayal. He was stronger, more resilient, and more self-assured. He had faced one of the darkest moments of his life, and had come out on the other side, ready to embrace a future that was entirely his own. One evening, as David sat on his porch watching the sunset, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. He had reclaimed his life, moved beyond the betrayal, and found happiness on his own terms. Emily and Jake were now just memories, their actions a reminder of a chapter he had closed. In the end, David found that true revenge wasn't in exposing them, it was in rebuilding himself, finding strength in his pain, and choosing to move forward. His life was his own again, and he was finally free. As David drove away from the cabin, a strange calm settled over him. The confrontation he had prepared for weeks was over, yet he felt a complex mixture of relief and emptiness. He had exposed their lies, watched them fall apart, and left them to face the truth they had so carefully hidden. But now, as he left them behind, he felt the first signs of a new chapter opening, one that didn't include either of them. The days that followed were both strange and difficult for David. On one hand, he felt a sense of freedom. He no longer had to pretend or hold back his feelings. The burden of betrayal had been lifted, and he felt as though he had taken back control of his life. But on the other hand, a deep sadness lingered. The life he had once known, the friends he had trusted, and the love he had believed in were all shattered. Moving on would take time, and he knew the journey wouldn't be easy. Back at home, David began taking the first steps to rebuild. He cleared out items that reminded him of Emily, removing photographs, gifts and souvenirs that were once cherished but now only brought pain. Each item he packed away felt like a small step toward letting go, a symbolic release of the memories they held. One evening, he opened a storage box that contained mementos from his time with Jake. Inside were photos from trips, shared adventures, and moments he once considered irreplaceable. Looking at those pictures now, he felt a bitter sting of betrayal. These memories were tarnished, reminders of a friendship that no longer existed. With a heavy heart, David put the box away, realizing that letting go of Jake was just as necessary as moving on from Emily. As David navigated his emotions, he received an outpouring of support from friends and family, who had seen the evidence he shared. Each call and message reminded him that he wasn't alone in this journey, that there were people who genuinely cared about him and respected the truth. Some friends expressed shock, others anger on his behalf, but all were united in their support for him. David's parents, who had been devastated to learn of Emily's betrayal, reached out to him regularly, checking on him and offering words of encouragement. Their love and concern gave him strength, a reminder that even though he'd lost people he once held close, he still had a strong support system. Over time, he felt comfortable enough to share more details with his closest friends. He opened up about the anger, hurt, and betrayal he had experienced, finding relief in their understanding and empathy. Talking about it was painful, but it also gave him a sense of validation. His friends listened without judgment, their presence a source of comfort as he began to heal. Despite the support, David knew that healing would require a fresh start. His home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison filled with memories he couldn't escape. Each room held reminders of the life he had shared with Emily, and even the smallest details, like the scent of her perfume lingering in the air, felt like a cruel reminder of her betrayal. After much consideration, David made the difficult decision to sell the house. It was a place that had once been filled with laughter and love, but now it held nothing but pain. Selling it felt like the right choice, a way to truly let go of the past and create space for a new beginning. As he prepared the house for sale, David felt a mixture of nostalgia and relief. He walked through each room one last time, allowing himself to remember the good moments without dwelling on the pain. With each step, he felt the weight of his past lifting, making room for the future he was ready to embrace. Once he finalized the sale of the house, David moved into a new apartment across town. It was smaller, simpler, and devoid of any memories tied to his old life. This fresh start was exactly what he needed, a blank canvas on which he could rebuild himself. In his new space, David began establishing new routines, small habits that brought him comfort and a sense of peace. Mornings spent with coffee and a book on his balcony, quiet evenings preparing meals for himself, and weekends exploring local parks and trails. These moments, though small, felt like steps toward reclaiming his life. As the days turned into weeks, David found himself feeling lighter. The pain of betrayal was still there, but it no longer consumed him. His new routines gave him a sense of stability, a reminder that he could find happiness on his own terms. David's new life began to take shape as he settled into his apartment. Every day brought small victories: a morning spent without the weight of sadness, an afternoon filled with laughter while chatting with family, or an evening where he felt genuinely at peace. Bit by bit, he felt the anger and betrayal begin to loosen their grip. One of the most surprising parts of this journey was how he found himself reconnecting with hobbies and passions he had left behind. In his marriage, he'd often prioritized Emily's interests over his own, adapting to her preferences and lifestyle. Now, alone in his new space, he rediscovered the joy of his own pursuits. With time on his hands, David took up painting, a passion he hadn't indulged in for years. As he set up his art supplies and began to create, he felt a strange sense of freedom. Each brushstroke was like an expression of emotions he couldn't put into words. The colors, the shapes, and the patterns he created were therapeutic, allowing him to pour out his thoughts and feelings onto the canvas. The process was cathartic, each session a step toward healing. David also began journaling, a practice recommended by a close friend. At first he was reluctant. Putting his feelings into words felt daunting, but as he started writing, he found it easier to process the complex emotions he had been holding inside. Through his entries, he allowed himself to revisit memories, express his anger, and even acknowledge the moments of happiness he had once shared with Emily. Writing gave him perspective, a way to step back and see his journey as a story of growth, rather than simply pain. Over the weeks, David noticed a subtle transformation within himself. The hobbies, the quiet moments alone, and the time spent in self-reflection gave him a newfound sense of confidence. He was learning to enjoy his own company, finding fulfillment in things he'd once set aside. As David healed, he felt ready to open himself up to new friendships. Slowly he began attending social events, meeting people who had no knowledge of his past, no idea of the betrayal he had endured. This anonymity was refreshing, allowing him to start fresh without the weight of judgment or pity. Through these new connections, David found a support system that helped him see life from a different perspective. His new friends brought laughter and lightheartedness into his days, giving him moments of joy that felt genuine and free of complications. They encouraged him to try new things, to venture beyond his comfort zone, and to embrace life with open arms. One weekend, his friends invited him on a hiking trip. Initially, David hesitated, uncertain about joining them on such a personal outing, but the experience turned out to be exactly what he needed. As he climbed the mountain trails, surrounded by nature's beauty, he felt a profound sense of clarity. The journey mirrored his own, filled with challenges, yet leading to a rewarding view at the top. That day, David realized that he was capable of moving forward, of facing new experiences with courage. One afternoon, David stopped by a local cafe to grab coffee after a long day of work. While waiting for his order, he struck up a conversation with a woman named Laura. She was kind, with a warm smile and a gentle sense of humor that put him at ease. Their chat was light, touching on topics like favorite books and local events, but there was a connection there that he hadn't felt in a long time. Over the following weeks, David and Laura continued to bump into each other at the cafe. Their conversations grew deeper, moving from casual topics to sharing personal stories and interests. For the first time since his divorce, David found himself looking forward to seeing someone, to connecting with someone who saw him for who he was now, not who he had been before. Laura had a calm, genuine energy that allowed David to feel comfortable opening up about his journey. He didn't share all the details, but he mentioned that he had been through a difficult time and was working on rebuilding his life. Laura listened without judgment, her presence a source of quiet reassurance. Though they were just friends, David appreciated the companionship. Laura's friendship was like a balm, a reminder that he could trust again, even if only a little. She encouraged him to continue healing, to keep exploring his passions, and to believe in the possibility of happiness beyond the past. As David's days filled with new friendships, hobbies, and routines, he also began prioritizing self-care. He realized that moving on wasn't just about letting go of the past, it was also about taking active steps to nurture his well-being. He started going to the gym regularly, discovering the satisfaction of physical activity. Each workout felt like a release, a way to channel his emotions constructively. David also took up meditation, learning to quiet his mind and find peace within. The practice wasn't easy at first. His thoughts often wandered back to painful memories, and staying still felt like a challenge. But over time he found that meditation helped him feel more centered, more present in each moment. The calm he achieved during these sessions became a source of strength, a reminder that he was capable of finding balance. One evening, as he reflected on his journey, David realized how far he had come. Months ago, he had been consumed by anger and heartbreak, unable to see a future beyond the betrayal. But now, he was building a life that felt authentic, a life that was his own. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled him. Instead, it served as a reminder of his resilience. David had rediscovered himself, and though the road had been long and challenging, he knew he was finally on the path to healing. He had reclaimed his happiness, one day at a time, and he was ready to embrace whatever came next. As David's life began to stabilize, he realized that healing was not a straight path, but a journey with moments of both clarity and struggle. He had embraced new routines, found supportive friends, and even formed a budding friendship with Laura. Still, there were days when the weight of the past crept back, bringing with it memories that stung. But each time he faced these emotions, he grew stronger, learning that moving forward meant accepting the pain without letting it define him. Over time, David felt more in control of his emotions. He no longer flinched at the thought of Emily and Jake, and he stopped questioning why things had happened the way they did. Instead, he viewed the experience as a lesson, a harsh, painful one, but a lesson nonetheless. He had discovered his resilience, and though the betrayal had hurt him deeply, it had also shown him his own strength. David began to believe that his best days were not behind him, but ahead. One evening, as David was organizing his apartment, he came across a box of old photographs. These were the remnants of his life before the trips he'd taken with Emily, the events shared with Jake, and memories of happier times that now felt distant. At first he considered throwing everything away. But then he stopped. realizing that the photos represented an important chapter of his life. Instead of discarding them, David sat down and went through each one. He allowed himself to remember the good moments, acknowledging that not everything had been a lie. There had been real joy, real connections, and for a time, real love. The memories were bittersweet, but David felt a surprising sense of peace as he looked back. He could accept that those times had meant something, even if the people involved had ultimately betrayed him. By the end of the evening, he had packed the photos back into the box, not to be thrown away, but to be stored as a part of his journey. David realized that moving on didn't mean erasing the past, it meant accepting it as part of the story that had shaped him. With this newfound acceptance, David felt lighter. The bitterness that had once clouded his thoughts was fading, replaced by a sense of closure. He no longer felt the urge to check on Emily or Jake, to wonder where they were or how they were coping. Their actions had affected him deeply, but he was ready to leave them in the past. David's decision to forgive, not for their sake, but for his own, was the final step in his healing. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what they had done or absolving them of responsibility. It simply meant freeing himself from the anger that had weighed him down for so long. He was no longer a victim of their choices, but a survivor who had taken back control of his life. Through this act of forgiveness, David felt as though a burden had lifted. He had reclaimed his narrative, transforming his pain into resilience. He was no longer defined by the betrayal, but by his ability to overcome it. With his heart open to new possibilities, David began exploring opportunities that he had once set aside. He had always wanted to travel but had put those dreams on hold during his marriage. Now, with no ties holding him back, he decided to fulfill that dream. David planned a trip to Europe, excited to explore new cultures, meet new people, and rediscover the joy of independence. The trip marked a fresh beginning, a chance to see the world through his own eyes, unfiltered by anyone else's influence. As he visited historic sites, wandered through bustling cities, and admired breathtaking landscapes, he felt a sense of renewal. Each new experience added to his confidence, reminding him that life had so much more to offer. The journey brought him a deep sense of peace. He was no longer running from his past but embracing his future with open arms. The world felt vast, filled with possibilities, and David knew he was ready to welcome them. When David returned from his travels, he was a changed man. The experiences he had gathered, the memories he had created, and the freedom he had felt abroad had transformed him. He returned with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to build a future that was truly his own. Laura, who had kept in touch throughout his travels, welcomed him back with warmth and genuine happiness. Their friendship had grown in his absence, with both of them finding support in each other's stories and experiences. Though there was no rush to label their relationship, David felt grateful for the connection they shared. It was a reminder that trust could be rebuilt, one step at a time. David's journey was far from over, but he was no longer burdened by the past. Instead, he looked forward with optimism, knowing that he had the strength to face whatever came his way. The betrayal that once consumed him was now just a chapter in his story, a story of resilience, self-discovery, and the courage to start anew. As David's life began to stabilize, he learned that healing wasn't a straight path but a journey, with moments of both clarity and struggle. He embraced new routines, built friendships, and even formed a bond with Laura. Still, memories of Emily and Jake sometimes resurfaced, bringing with them echoes of pain. But each time, David grew stronger, realizing that true healing meant facing the past without letting it define his future. He no longer flinched at thoughts of Emily and Jake, and he stopped questioning why they had betrayed him. Instead, he saw the experience as a lesson in resilience. Betrayal had left him shattered, but through it, he discovered his strength. The journey wasn't easy, but he realized that his best days were ahead, not behind him. One evening, while organizing his apartment, David found a box of old photographs, remnants of the life he once shared with Emily and Jake. For a moment, he considered discarding it all, but then he stopped. These memories were part of his story, even if they were now bittersweet. He allowed himself to reflect, acknowledging that while things had changed, the joy he'd once felt was real. Rather than discarding the photos, David carefully packed them back into the box, placing it in the back of his closet. Moving on didn't mean erasing his past, it meant accepting it as part of the journey that had led him to where he was. Over time, David let go of the bitterness that once clouded his heart. He no longer felt compelled to check on Emily or Jake, nor did he wonder about their lives. Their choices had been painful, but he was determined to leave them in the past. He chose forgiveness not for their sake, but for his own. Forgiveness didn't erase what they had done, it simply freed him from the anger that had held him captive. This decision felt like a final step in his healing. The betrayal no longer defined him. He was a survivor, someone who had taken back control, finding peace in his newfound strength. With his heart open to the future, David began exploring dreams he had set aside. He'd always wanted to travel, but his marriage had kept him grounded. Now, with nothing holding him back, he planned a trip to Europe. This journey marked a fresh beginning, an opportunity to see the world on his own terms. As he wandered through foreign cities, admired historic sights, and took in breathtaking landscapes, David felt a deep sense of renewal. He returned home with a new sense of freedom, grateful for the life he was building. Back in his own city, David found comfort in reconnecting with Laura. Their friendship had grown in his absence, and her support had been a source of quiet strength. Though he was in no rush to label their relationship, he appreciated the companionship they shared. Laura had shown him that trust could be rebuilt, even if slowly. David's journey was far from over, but he was no longer haunted by the past. Instead, he looked forward with optimism. Emily and Jake were now just memories, part of a chapter he had closed. His story was one of resilience, growth, and courage, the courage to rebuild, to trust again, and to embrace a future filled with possibilities. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, revenge, and resilience, there's so much more waiting for you. Don't miss out on more gripping tales that dive deep into intense emotions and unforgettable twists. Subscribe to stay tuned for the next story that will keep you on the edge of your seat.